Look at this tub of 2.5-inch scrappy squares we've accumulated. Do you have a bunch of these also, or possibly 2.5-inch scrappy strips? I have just the quilt pattern for you then. The Mesa Mirage quilt pattern consists entirely of 2.5-inch squares and 2.5-inch strips. You'll need 375 2.5-inch squares. To be clear, I'm not proposing that you use scrappy strips for the vertical strips or rectangles in this pattern, but you could cut those 2.5-inch strips into 2.5-inch squares for this pattern. I personally feel that the strips serving as a background fabric need to be a single fabric. If you use scrappy for the vertical strips, the design or look of this pattern would be lost. To help you visualize how this pattern might look different with different background fabrics, let me show you 3 variations. Here's the option I plan to go with, a dark background fabric. If you chose a white on white background fabric, it could look something like this. And finally, a gray background fabric would look like this. Why don't you look through your stash and see what you have available for the background fabric? You'll need 1.5 yards of background fabric. Here's the background fabric I plan to use. This is Impressions by Connecting Threads. Now you could do the piecing of this quilt pattern in vertical columns, joining all the strips and squares in each vertical column, then joining all the vertical columns together as rows. However, a nice feature of this quilt pattern is that I've defined logical units so that it will be more like making blocks. Then once the units are done, they can be joined together as rows. Since there are background strips above and below each horizontal mesa pattern, you can see here how I've divided the pattern into units. The units start and stop on a horizontal row that is continuous and has no strips that extend on both sides of the horizontal row. I thought this would be much easier than having to work with all those very long vertical column strips. With the way the quilt pattern is divided into units, some of the units are the same, as you can see, and so there are separate instructions for each of the different unit types. And of course, if you go with the ombre effect in your quilt, you have to remember that as you make these units, that the ombre effect is another factor in how you arrange the 2.5-inch squares within the unit. This scrappy quilt pattern is very versatile. For example, the simplest approach would be to randomly choose from your 2.5-inch scrappy squares as you make each unit. If you take this approach, you'd most likely just have to take care not to place 2 of the same scrappy fabrics side by side. Another option would be to use an ombre effect, as I've illustrated in this quilt pattern. The ombre effect is illustrated in color families, as you can see here. My plan is to just group the scrappy squares into shades from dark to light. In my case, I plan to arrange an entire ombre effect all at once and label the squares. However, if you feel you can pull it off and want to do an ombre effect without using labels, you could just arrange the scrappy squares to achieve an ombre effect as you go along making each unit. I mentioned some of this earlier, but just quickly again to show you, for your scrappy fabric, you're going to need about 1 3/4 yards. And for your background fabric, shown here as white on white, you're going to need 1.5 yards. A quick look at the cutting instructions. If you haven't already cut your 2.5-inch scrappy squares, you'll need 375 of those. If you're taking those from strips, you'll need 24 2.5-inch strips. And then for the background fabric listed here as white on white again, you'll notice that we're cutting various lengths of 2.5-inch. We have rectangles that are 10.5 inches long, 8.5 inches, 6.5 inches, and 4.5 inches, and a few 2.5-inch squares. To make all of those, we would need 21 strips of 2.5 inches from our background fabric. These are a few notes. I'm assuming a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Also, you can press the seams as desired. I am going to talk a little bit about seam pressing with those 2.5-inch squares. And then for width of fabric, I'm assuming in the pattern it's just over 42 inches. I'm going to go ahead and arrange my 2.5-inch scrap squares in shades from light to dark. This will make it easier for me when I'm trying to lay out one of the Mesa patterns, those horizontal patterns with an ombre effect. Okay, so this is what it ended up with from light to dark. Now that I have these pre-sorted, I'm going to need to get my background fabric ready. Well, as usual, I have a few wrinkles here, so I'm going to press this background fabric first. I need to cut 21 strips of 2.5 inch. Now that I have my strips cut, I'll need to move on to cutting out the rectangles. And here you can see that we need to cut 57 of the 10.5 inch, 2.5 inch rectangles, and then 12 each of the 8.5, 6.5, and a 4.5 inch by 2.5 inch rectangles, and then finally 7 of the 2.5 inch squares for our background fabric. And here I have all my rectangles and squares cut out from the background fabric. As I mentioned earlier, I am going to try to achieve this ombre effect. So the first thing I'm going to do before I start making the units seen here at the top is I'm going to arrange the squares to achieve the ombre effect on the floor, and then I'm going to label those. I'm sure there's a better way to do this labeling, but I always end up finding some old Avery type of labels we had for, I don't know, postage or something like that, and end up just using those and cutting out smaller labels from them. But anyways, if you have better ideas for labeling large quantities of fabric pieces arranged in a certain way, post your comments. But I found that this helps me to avoid putting things back together in the wrong arrangement. One tip here, if you decide to label these fabric pieces and you do an ombre effect, is I decided to stop horizontally where the first row of units stop and label those in a logical way together, and then start at the next row of logical units for that part of the ombre effect and label those. I'm not labeling any of the vertical strips of the background fabric because those are fairly self-explanatory if you just look at the diagram for how the units go together. Now I'm going to move on to making the left unit in the first row. Here on page 6 we can see the instructions for making units 1 and 2. So these are in that first row. In the first row, the left and middle units, those correspond to unit 1 as far as piecing instructions. The right unit in the first row corresponds to unit 2 as far as the piecing instructions are concerned. Here on the sewing table I have all the pieces laid out for the first unit. Time to start joining these pieces together. So for each unit I will join all the pieces, all the squares and rectangles in a vertical column first. And then all of those will form a strip, and I'll join all those strips together to form the unit. Here you can see I have all the vertical strips of pieces joined together for the unit. Now I'm pressing these strips and pressing to the side, and I am alternating the direction, and that is so that I can take advantage of nesting to help align the seams when I'm joining all these vertical strips together to form that unit. And here's that first unit all joined together. It's going to be interesting to see how this looks once I get a row of these units with the entire ombre effect. It's time to make the middle unit in the first row. The middle unit in the first row of the quilt is the same as that first one, so unit 1 again, as far as the piecing or arranging of the pieces within the unit. Here are the pieces for the middle unit of the first row in the quilt laid out on the sewing table. And here's that middle unit of row 1 all joined together. And here are the left unit and the middle unit in the first row next to each other, starting to get the effect. Now I'm going to make the right unit in the first row. And this corresponds to unit 2 as far as the piecing instructions are concerned. Here are all the pieces laid out on the sewing table for the right unit in the first row. And here's the completed right unit from the first row. And here's a quick look at all the units from the first row side by side. I think this is going to turn out nice. Before I can move on to making the units in the second row of the quilt, I need to arrange my next ombre effect in the quilt itself because the second row of units actually include squares from that second ombre effect. Now I'm going to make the left unit in the second row. Both the second and third rows are consisting of units that are based on the instructions for making Unit 3 and Unit 4 as far as the piecing goes. Since we're making the left unit from row 2, we'll focus in on the instructions as far as the illustration of Unit 3. Here I have all the pieces laid out on the sewing table for the left unit in row 2. Now these units are slightly taller than the units from the first row, so the nesting and the pressing of the seams is even more important here. And here's that left unit from the second row all joined together. Now I'm going to make the middle unit in the second row, and this unit is using the piecing instructions for Unit 3. Here are all the pieces for the unit laid out on the sewing table, and here is the completed middle unit for the second row. Now I'm going to make the right unit in the second row. The Unit 4 piecing instructions correspond to this unit. Here are all the pieces laid out on the sewing table for the right unit in row 2. And here's the completed right unit for row number 2. And here's a quick look at all 3 units for row number 2 laid out together on the floor. Before I can move on to making the units in the third row, once again I need to arrange the next ombre effect because the third row of units includes some of the squares from that third and final ombre effect. Now I'm going to make the left unit in the third row, and this unit is using the piecing instructions for Unit 3. Here are all the pieces laid out on the sewing table for the left unit in row 3, and here's the left unit from row 3 all put together. Now I'm going to make the middle unit in the third row, and this unit is using the piecing instructions for Unit 3. Here are all the pieces for the middle unit in the third row laid out on the sewing table. Here's the middle unit from the third row all joined together. Now I'm going to make the right unit in the third row. This is following the piecing instructions for Unit 4. Here I have all the pieces for the right unit of row 3 laid out on the sewing table. And here's the right unit from row 3 all joined together. And here are all 3 units from row 3 laid out on the floor together. These are looking nice. Now I'm moving on to row 4 and making the left unit. The units in row 4 use different piecing instructions. Now we have to move to page 7 in our pattern, and we're looking at the instructions for Unit 5. Row 4 is similar to row 1 in that the units are shorter, they're not quite as tall. And here I have all the pieces for the left unit from row 4 laid out on the sewing table. And here's the left unit from row 4 all joined together. Now I'm going to make the middle unit in the fourth row. And again, the middle unit of the fourth row is using Unit 5 piecing instructions. I forgot to take a photo of all the pieces laid on the sewing table, but here's the completed middle unit from row 4. We finally got to the last unit, the right unit in the fourth row. The right unit in the fourth row uses the Unit 6 piecing instructions found here on page 7. And here are all the pieces laid out on the sewing table for the right unit in row 4. And here's the right unit from row 4 all joined together. Wouldn't you know it, on this last unit I slipped up and put 2 scrappy fabrics the same side by side. So it happens. And here's a quick look at all 3 units from row 4 laid out on the floor side by side. Here on page 7, you'll notice that to make the inner quilt or the quilt top, we're going to refer to the figure A1 on page 5 of our pattern. And that's that diagram we've been referring to. And this just illustrates how to assemble each of the rows units into a row, and then those rows into the upper half and bottom half of the quilt. As I was making the units for each row, I showed you all of those laid out on the floor side by side. So now I'm just going to proceed to join those units, and I'll start by making the first row. And here's that first row with all the units joined together. Time to move on to making the second row. And here's that second row with all the units joined together. Now go ahead and join the first 2 rows to make the upper half of the quilt. Here's the upper half of the quilt all joined together. I'm liking this ombre effect. Next, I'm going to join the units together to make the third row. And here's the third row, all those units joined together. This one looks nice. Time to join the units together to make our last row, the fourth one. Here's that last row, all joined together. Time to join rows 3 and 4 to make the bottom half of the quilt. You may have your own preferences for how to join these long rows that have this many seams that are lining up together, but I find that pinning is definitely a necessity for me. So I pin just about every other seam on these long stretches. And there's the completed bottom half of the quilt top. So now we need to join the bottom half and top half to form the entire quilt top. And here are the top and bottom halves laid out on the floor, ready to go. And there it is, the quilt top all joined together. And this is turning out really nice, I think. Leave your comments, let me know what you think. Here you can see the quilt pattern that we chose. Kind of looks like a puzzle, doesn't it? That pattern looks like a puzzle you would put together. Just sharing a little bit of the long arm running to do the quilting. Thought you might enjoy seeing a little bit of that. And here's a close-up view of that quilting. For the binding, we looked at several fabrics we had, and we ended up choosing this one, Timeless Treasures fabric of Soho. It's kind of a stripe pattern. Here I have my 2.5 inch strips cut out for the binding. I needed 6 of them to leave a little extra to do the seam joining at the end. I joined all those strips together, and then I pressed the binding, folding it in half so it's ready to go. Once the binding was done, I took it outside and hung it on the pole barn so we could get a nice picture out in the sunlight. I think I like the way it turned out. The only thing I would say is one regret I have. I wish I had done color families for my ombre effects. The light to dark mixing colors was easier, but I think the darker portion of the ombre effect would have shown up more against the background fabric had I used color families like I have in the pattern illustrated, like green or red or some other type of colors. So if you make this quilt, it's something you might think about. You might also think about what kind of contrast you're going to have between your background fabric and the fabric you use within the scrappy portion of the quilt. Here's a little bit of a close-up view outside of the quilting. Sometimes inside the house it's hard to see the quilting very good, but once you get out in the sunlight you can see it a little better.